it's really an honor, and I've had the pleasure to hang out with President Rice and learn about what you do, and I truly think what you are heroes. You know, you save lives, you save homes, you save communities, and that's a really honorable purpose. And today I get to talk about my purpose, and something I've been doing now for over 40 years is climbing big mountains. And probably similar to you, a lot of people always ask, why do you do what you do? You know, there's risk, it's hard, it's not always fun. And in fact, that's why I do what I do. I love all that stuff. And it changed the course of my life. When I started climbing, I thought it would be a hobby. And I became so immersed in it that I had to figure out how to turn it into a profession. So this is where I get to go to work. It's a great view, as you can imagine, from my office, but it's a hell of a commute. And you know, what I like about what I do is, and I have to do it as you do, is embracing the process. When I go on a Himalayan expedition, one single event, one single climb on one of the biggest mountains in the world in the middle of nowhere could take 3 months. And prior to that event, I have to plan and prepare to be ready for that event. And quite often I've got 6 or 8 months to get myself ready. And it's always been my fear of failure that is my motivator. You know, if I've got the time to get ready, I'm going to get ready. I'm going to train physically for this event. I'm going to put a team together, raise the money. All the equipment has to be organized, the logistics, the permits. And that's what I call doing my homework. Because when I'm on the mountain, that's where the test begins, right? I'm not going to get stronger. I can't make stuff appear out of nowhere. It all has to be well thought of before I even go. And when I start climbing these mountains, you know, as you get higher, as you get closer to your goal, which is the top, it never gets easier, right? And these mountains are relentless. It gets colder, it gets windier, steeper, oxygen deprivation, all those things are pushing against you. These mountains are relentless, and therefore I've had to learn how to be relentless as well. There's never a guarantee of success in spite of your preparation or investment. But when you do achieve success, when you do stand on the summit, to me, that's an amazing feeling, because at that point, the reward is huge. You look back on that investment of time and energy and struggle and being uncomfortable, and you forget all that, and you go, wow, this is pretty cool. And you want to do it again and again and again. And that became my addiction. So again, never a guarantee of success, but what there is a guarantee of, and in your world as well, something we can't avoid or can't eliminate, is risk. You know, in my world, I've decided to separate the risk into 2 different categories. You know, people think that we go climbing to seek the risk. And in fact, we don't. I've learned, one of the biggest lessons I learned in my career was how to manage risk. That's why I'm standing here today. You know, we have the objective risk category, as you do, the things you can't eliminate, the things you're confronted with that you really don't have a control over. We have weather, we have storms, we have avalanches, rockfall, altitude-related illnesses. And in fact, that's the smallest category of risk. The biggest category of risk in my world is the subjective part. It's decision-making, right? And in my world, you can imagine there's a lot of people that go climbing these mountains. They're motivated, they're ambitious. For many of these people, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They invest a lot of money to be on a mountain, and quite often, they might not get another chance to be there. And they then are more than willing to push beyond what's called normal. Ambition overcomes common sense, and it becomes a one-way trip to the summit. I started to think about this a long time ago when I started climbing. I said, man, I love climbing, but what I like a lot more is being alive. And so my attitude was always, it's got to be a round trip, right? That is my goal. Getting to the summit is optional. Getting home is mandatory. And that's a rule that I lived by. And that was something that kept me alive, learning how to temper my ambition. And so about 15 years ago, somebody said, you should write about what you learned. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, is those incidental lessons that I learned along the way that I didn't think I would learn. And I'd never planned on writing a book, but we put this book together, and I wanted to talk about that journey and that process, and leaving that path of footprints behind you, feeling good about how you got to where you got, and also knowing that you can't take a shortcut. And in my world, we can't take a shortcut to success. You've got to earn it day by day, step by step, breath by breath. And amazingly, this book's done really well, but I think I would have sold way more had I titled it Shortcuts to the Top, right? What's the secret sauce? But hopefully it's also inspirational. And it was, in fact, a book that I read as a kid that was my inspiration. I read this book. At the time, I was growing up in the great mountaineering state of Illinois, and it was this story that captivated me. It was the story of an expedition that took place in 1950 on this mountain here called Annapurna. Now, Annapurna is one of only 14 mountains in the world over this magic metric number of 8,000 meters, which is anything above 26,000 feet, Everest being the highest at 29,000 feet. And all of these 8,000 meter peaks are literally halfway around the world, all the way from Western Pakistan through the eastern part of Nepal. So you've got to go halfway around the world just to get to one of these monsters. And Annapurna is kind of smack dab in the middle. And in 1950, a group of climbers from France went to attempt Annapurna. Now, none of the 8,000 meter peaks at the time had been successfully climbed, not even Everest. So this would be a pretty big deal, not just for mountaineering, but for the country of France as well. And this team of 7 climbers, they had a support staff, they had a doctor, they had a base camp manager. They literally step off the map. There's no form of communication in those days. You're in the middle of nowhere, you disappear for 3 months, and then you come back. What happens? Through teamwork and leadership and everybody working together and everybody contributing, they succeeded. They pulled it off. They got 2 of their team to the summit. Not the whole team goes to the top, but 2 people typically plant the flag. And that's how I learned about the essence of teamwork and collaboration. You're unified. You go together, you work together, everybody has a role and responsibility, and you succeed as a team. And that, to me, was an amazing event. How they accomplished something that was nearly impossible. And it inspired me to the point where I thought, that is something I want to do. Eventually, someday in my life, I want to climb one of those big, giant Himalayan mountains. How do I do that? And I said, it's not going to happen tomorrow. There's a lot of training I need to do, a lot of lessons I need to learn, people to meet, a lot of steps to take. And I thought it's going to take 10 years to get to that upper level of mountaineering. And that was my goal. 10 years from now, I'm going to be ready. So again, a lot of steps to take. The first step I knew I had to take was to get the hell out of Illinois. So right out of high school, I moved to Seattle, Washington. The reason being, it's this beautiful city surrounded by mountains, so the opportunity is there. And all the books that I read about American mountaineers, they came from the Pacific Northwest. And I said, if I want to be the best, I want to surround myself by the best and allow myself the opportunities to learn in this environment. As a kid, my goal, my career path, I had already decided that I wanted to be a veterinarian. That would be my profession. Climbing would be my hobby. So I put myself through college. I went 4 years, University of Washington, graduated with a degree in zoology, went 4 more years to medical school. And during that education, I didn't have any support. So I worked through college, I had loans, I had grants, so I was very self-invested. But in any of my free time, summers, weekends, holidays, I was climbing. That was the reason I was in Seattle. And this is this mountain that you can see from downtown, 2 hours away. This is Mount Rainier, 14,400 feet high. It is a giant mini Himalayan experience. And this, I thought, for me, would be that perfect test ground. Steep, glaciated, high altitude, crappy weather. And I thought, whatever I learn on this mountain, it could be a stepping stone for me to go to something bigger and even higher. And so not knowing anything about climbing, I had to find people that were willing to take me into the mountains and teach me. And I became an apprentice. Just like you guys, you teach your younger climbers and your younger workers how to do what you do. And this is how I learned, by being fully immersed. And one of the biggest things I learned right away was how to unify as a team, how to create safety. And in my world, we rope up together. We connect physically with a rope. If somebody falls, it's my job to help that person stop. If there's a crevasse in the snow, it helps that person from plummeting 200 feet into the ice. And that unity is very synergistic. You know, if you got two people on a rope, the parts are more than the sum. It's 1 + 1 = 3. And it also implies implicit trust. You know, when you connect to somebody with a rope, you are trusting that person with their skill set, and that person is trusting you with your skill set. And we in the mountaineering world call that the brotherhood of the rope. And as I climbed more after 3, 4, 5 years of gaining experience on my own, I finally applied for and got a job to work as a guide on Mount Rainier. And that was in 1982. And it wasn't my goal to be a professional guide my whole life, but I thought here I could be fully immersed in this job. Every single summer for 10 years in a row, 3 months this summer, I would be climbing on Mount Rainier and, very importantly, guiding people to the summit. And we also had a mentorship program on Mount Rainier. We had the super senior guides that taught the senior guides, that taught the apprentices. And I was the only higher person that year, and I was affectionately known as the peon, right? I cleaned the toilets, I swept the floors, I kept my mouth shut, and I worked hard. But this is where I learned a lot. And the biggest thing I learned was how to take care of others as well as myself. You know, we have people coming to us, clients, customers, seeking the summit of Mount Rainier. This is a product that we're selling. But we have to always, as guides, evaluate the environment around us. And that's what tells us how to do what we're doing, right? These people are traveling from all over the world. They've spent a lot of money. They have high expectations, but that doesn't guarantee success. Number one, our goal as guides for customer satisfaction is to keep our clients alive, right? Rule number one. Second to that is to give them an experience. And if we can, we want to get them to the summit of Mount Rainier. But we have to have situational awareness and make decisions in the moment. We try to prevent something from happening rather than let it happen. And it's that awareness that allows us to hopefully make safe decisions, to temper our ambition. And so we're always taking in information. What's the weather doing? What's the wind speed? What's the time of the day? How strong is my team? And in my world, we call that listening to the mountain, because ultimately it decides what we do. We don't decide. We get to do what the mountain allows us to do. Do we keep going? If the risk is increasing, do we stop and do we wait? Or do we actually retreat and wait for something better? And I think that listening to the mountain was the biggest takeaway of my career as a guide. And that's what kept me alive as well. And then through that mentorship program and the training that we were allowed to do, I was brought along on bigger, higher, further reaching mountains. And I was slowly climbing that ladder of experience. And eventually I started to think that, you know, maybe possibly someday Everest would be on my bucket list. And if you're a mountaineer, you want to try to climb the highest mountain in the world. And so I try to research these mountains. I try to learn about the history. You know, what have people done right? What have they done wrong? What's it like to be there? So I'm familiar with that mountain. What's its personality? And Everest was first climbed in 1953 by the British. They had attempted the mountain for 30 years, and they finally pulled it off in 1953. And this is the team that went to Everest. 40 people went on that expedition. And for 3 months, they worked together. And in the end, they put 2 people on the summit, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. And that was an amazing feat in human endeavor. You know, they had unity, they had purpose, they had collaboration. This is something that Yvonne talked about. Those were the key ingredients to success. Plus, as well, climbing to 29,000 feet physically is very, very demanding, as you can imagine. There's only 1/3 the amount of oxygen on the summit as there is at sea level. So to supplement that, climbers use supplemental oxygen. And I think because the first ascent of Everest was done with Everest, even today, the majority of people that go to Everest also use supplemental oxygen. And why not? In essence, what that supplemental oxygen does is it reduces the relative altitude of the mountain by 10,000 feet. So you're taking a 29,000 foot mountain and you're bringing it down to 19,000 feet so that you could stand on the summit and say that you climbed Everest. I personally don't have anything against oxygen, nor do I have anything against people that climb with oxygen. But for me, it didn't seem fair to the mountain. I thought it was a contrived way of gaining success. And for most people, when they go to Everest, they don't really care how they get to the top. They just want to get to the top and say they climbed to the summit of Everest. For me, it was more important how I got to the top. And I thought it would be way more interesting to see if I could test myself physically, mentally, and emotionally to try to climb to 29,000 feet and not use oxygen. And that was a hard, fast rule for me. I said, no matter what, I'm not going to cave. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to only try to get to the summit without oxygen and not use oxygen simply to get there. It was a hard, fast rule. I knew it'd be harder. Chance of success would be less, but it'd be more interesting and rewarding. And second to that, it'd be cheaper. You know, I wouldn't have to buy the oxygen. So off I kept climbing, kept learning, kept training, kept meeting people, had great mentors. And in 1987, lo and behold, 10 years into my career, one of my mentors on Rainier, Eric Simonson, invited me to join an expedition to go to Mount Everest. And we would be a small team. There was only going to be 7 of us going on this journey. So Everest is on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and we're climbing on the Nepal side. So you fly into Kathmandu, and then from there with a small plane, you go to the last village that has an airstrip. And then from there, to get to base camp, to the foot of the mountain, it takes 8 days of walking. And knowing we're going to be in the middle of nowhere for 3 months, trying to climb that mountain, all that stuff that we need to survive with and use has to be brought with us. Mountains of equipment, food, tents, ropes, anchors, oxygen, food, fuel, sleeping bags, all that stuff has to be brought in with us as we're walking in. So we hire dozens and dozens of lowland porters. They do the journey with us. We finally arrive here at base camp, which is at 18,000 feet. The porters drop the gear and equipment, they leave, and we say, come back in 3 months. And this is where we set up shop. This is where we're now going to live and operate out of for literally the next 3 months. So we have to have brought everything that we need with us, all the supplies, right? Because if you forgot something, there's no 7-Eleven around the corner. There's no Ace Hardware. That could be the cause of failure. So there's a lot of planning and preparation just to get to base camp. And that's where we then start the process of climbing the mountain. You can't go from base camp to the summit in one push. It's too far, it's too high. It's eventually going to take 5 days of climbing to get to the summit. And before we can even think about doing that, which is 2.5 months away, we spend the majority of the time of the expedition carrying loads to these 4 camps that we need to establish above us. And it's that process where we have to be unified as a team. Everybody is expected to contribute. You know, if there's only 7 people on a team, and if one guy isn't pulling his weight, there's that ripple effect. Yeah, you might have to help that person out occasionally, but you're expected to contribute. And what that means is from base camp, right out of the gates, you put a pack on, you load it up with 50, 60 pounds of equipment, and day after day, 8, 10 days in a row, you carry a load to Camp 1, which is a day's climb above base camp. You drop that load and you go back to base camp. The next day, you do it again. The next day, you do it again. And then the next day, you do it again until you have enough supplies at Camp 1. You move a couple of guys in there, and then they start hauling the loads to Camp 2. Camp 2 is set up, Camp 3. And so we're like ants on an anthill, sending up a supply chain of stuff, very methodically, very timely. And that is the hardest part of the event. 8 weeks of this work just to get all these camps set up and supplied. It is necessary as well, though, because it allows us to slowly acclimatize, to build more red blood cells, to absorb whatever oxygen is around us. But as you can imagine, it can be very physically and mentally and emotionally debilitating, because that's all you're doing every day is throwing a pack on your back and climbing back up again and dropping a load and knowing you're going to do it again and again and again. And that's where you need to have mental fortitude and have to be resilient. And as you go higher, also, because of the lack of oxygen, the amount of physical work that you can do goes down. By the time we approach and reach Camp 4, the final and highest camp, this is at 26,000 feet, we can't carry 60 pounds anymore. We might be able to carry 20 pounds. And so that supply chain starts to trickle to the point where Camp 4 ends up being one little tiny assault camp with just enough room for 2 people. That's how the logistics of this works out. And that's exactly how it worked out in 1953. That group of people put one little tent up at Camp 4. So we set up Camp 4, and what do we do then? We go all the way back down to base camp. Because now we have to take the time to recover a little bit. You know, in the rich atmosphere of 18,000 feet, your appetite returns. We wait for a window of opportunity because we've now got to send 2 people back up the mountain all the way to Camp 4. And on that 5th and final day, hopefully they're going to go to the summit. That's why we're here. And that by far is the hardest day still ahead. Knowing that, we have to pick the 2 people that are going to represent the team and plant the flag on the summit. And how do you do that? We have a team meeting at base camp. The leader looks around the room and he says, you know, show of hands, who wants to go to the summit? Nobody raises their hand. Because at this point, you just want to go home, right? You're tired, you're homesick, you've lost 15 pounds, you know, you've had diarrhea for 4 weeks. I mean, there's so many things that conspire to debilitate you on these mountains. It's amazing that we actually reach the summit. But the selection process is based on who's still strong, who's still motivated, and who has contributed during that event, right? I was one of the 2 people selected. And I thought, wow, what an honor. I get to go to the summit of Everest. I'm representing this team, this effort. But also imagine the pressure of success now, the expectation that's on our shoulders, all that investment of time and energy. So we leave base camp, we climb for 4 days, we finally get back to Camp 4. This is at 26,000 feet. We're now camped above the clouds. And the plan is that next morning, we're going to make the summit push. And we're going to leave that camp in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning. Climb out of the tent, headlamps on, 30 below zero. And the reason we leave so early is we know that one-way trip to the summit is going to take 12 hours, let alone 5 or 6 hours to get back down to that camp. That's an 18-hour day. physically very, very demanding, but you want to start early to give yourself time to get down before it gets dark, and also to leave room in case of an emergency to deal with those events. So that's how you plan. You plan your departure based on when you want to get back. So it's kind of a reverse plan. And for the first 8 or 10 hours of that final summit push, things were going great. I was doing fine. My partner's doing good. He's climbing with oxygen. I'm climbing without. And I thought, sure as hell, we're going to make it to the summit of Everest. And we finally here get to within 300 feet of the summit. We're standing here on that final summit ridge. And because of how slowly you're going, because of the lack of oxygen, we knew that last 300 feet was going to take 2 hours to accomplish. And at that point, the weather started to deteriorate. A storm was coming. It started to snow. It got windier. We're losing visibility. And we very quickly had to make a decision as to what to do. Standing there on the ridge, we had a meeting. What do we do? What do we want to do? Of course, we wanted to go to the summit. But what was the risk? What were the consequences of that? We figured no matter what, we could crawl to the summit, plant the flag, that would be success. But because of that storm, we would more than likely die on the way down, and that would not be good. So based on our perceived risk, and I think you call this the trigger point, we decided there and then to stop and to turn around 300 feet from the top of Everest. And imagine making that decision. I knew what the rules were, and I'm so proud about the fact that I didn't break the rules that I learned. But I've seen this a lot. People go up there, they're faced with that decision, and they start thinking about it, and they say, this is my once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I've already told people I'm climbing to Everest. I've spent a ton of money being here. I am not going to turn around. And that's what causes people to die in the mountains. That alone. Ambition overcomes common sense. We walked away, and I felt good about that. I didn't want to not go to the top, but I wasn't allowed to go to the top. And I kind of felt that I would probably more than likely have another opportunity to go back. So it all had to do with patience, right? If it doesn't happen today, retreat, wait for better conditions, go back and try again. And that's the way I looked at it. The next year I got invited to go to Everest again. This would be now my second attempt on this mountain. And we had, once again, even worse conditions. And we didn't even barely scratch the surface. So there's 2 strikes against me on Everest. And at this point in my life, I was now in what I call the big leagues of mountaineering. And literally for the next 20 years, I would go on at least 1, if not 2, Himalayan expeditions every single year. My third trip, the third year in a row, was a different mountain. This is a mountain called Kanchenjunga, third highest peak in the world, little over 28,000 feet, technically a little harder to climb than Everest. This is a 3,000-foot sheet of ice that we had to climb on our way to the summit. And after 2.5 months of effort, 3 of us from this team stood on the summit. My very first summit of an 8,000-meter peak. And it's literally this little island in the sky floating above the clouds. And people often ask, how long do you stay up there? Depends on the time of day, depends on the weather, sometimes as long as an hour, sometimes as little as 5 minutes. And if the weather's good and you get this amazing reward of looking out on other mountains, and there, 80 miles to the west, just left of center, you can see Everest. So it's pretty amazing to get to the summit. And a lot of people say, wow, that's when you celebrate, right? You've accomplished your goal. You've achieved the top of this thing that you went to climb. To me, that's always, in my opinion, premature. You don't celebrate on the summit, right? You're as far removed from safety as possible. You can't celebrate until you get down. And people lose sight of that in these big mountains because they use all of their energy and resources and oxygen and daylight just to get to the summit. And going down, there's no gas left in the tank. There's no energy left. There's no daylight. And most of the accidents in the mountains occur not on the way up, but on the way down. You have to budget for your return, right? That's the most important part of any event, budgeting to get home. And a climb is not a climb by definition until you're taking your boots off at base camp. So that was a success for me. And finally, the next year, 1990, my third invitation to once again to climb Mount Everest. This is the route we climbed. It's on the north side, on the Tibetan side. We'd set up our 4 camps, spent 10 weeks doing so. And on that final day, this was May 10th, 1990, I had yet again another opportunity to try to go to the summit of Everest. And on this particular day, I was alone. It's just the way the logistics of that climb played out. I was okay with being alone. I felt I could handle the terrain with my skill set. But the hard part about being alone, going uphill in the middle of nowhere for 12 hours, is that you're alone, right? Nobody to make a decision with, nobody to motivate with. And more importantly, if the snow is deep, nobody to take turns breaking a trail through the snow. Ultimately, in the end, that was the hardest physical, mental day of my life. Because at those altitudes, you're literally in outer space. And because of the lack of oxygen, literally I had to count 15 breaths between each step. And then I would count 15 breaths and take another step. And to go the width of this room at those altitudes could take an hour. So you have to be extremely patient, extremely persistent, and you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because it can be excruciating. And so you're climbing along and you're gasping for air and you got snot on your face and it's 8 hours and 9 hours and 10 hours and you finally go, why am I doing this, right? And you start to think about all the legitimate excuses to quit. You know, I'm up there alone. I don't have to keep going. Who cares? I'm the only guy that cares. I could say it was too hard. I didn't like it. I wasn't having fun. But you have to put all those things out of your mind. If conditions are good, you just keep going. And I had to break that immense 12-hour day into smaller, tangible goals, right? I had to pick a rock 100 feet away and climb to that rock, and then look a crack of the snow, make that an object. And that's the way I nibbled away. Goals, steps, and breaths. And finally, 12 hours later, I took that last step, and I found myself on the summit of Everest. And this is the view that you get. I was at that point the highest person on planet Earth, not on drugs, but just standing there. And it's such an amazing feeling to do a 360 and look down on every other thing. It was a great highlight of my life. Really cool. And to be there alone is very unique. But I thought, not so cool. Who's going to take my picture, right? I need something for the office. So you have to remember, this is 1990. We didn't have iPhones. We didn't have digital cameras. It was a film camera where you had to set the aperture, set the timer, set the focal length. And I sucked my ice axe into the snow, balanced my camera on top of it, heard the camera go click, and then prayed to God when I got home a month later, developed the film that photo actually turned out, right? And it did. This is my selfie from the summit of Everest. So a little harder to accomplish than today, right? You don't take 20 photos with a camera like an iPhone. You take one and you pray. Highlight of my life. I'd now climbed the highest point on Earth. And for any mountaineer, that could be the capstone of a mountaineering career, right? And by the way, I was still trying to work as a veterinarian. And imagine me being your employee, every few months coming up to you and say, hey, boss, what do you think? Another 3 months? Can I take another 3 months off? I got this other thing to climb. So I was starting to be conflicted in my career path. And I thought after a while that really wasn't working well. What was I going to do? And this was the biggest career risk that I took, is I decided to leave my career as a veterinarian so that I could focus 100% on my climbing. And I wasn't sure how that was going to work out. How long could I do it? How would I fund it? How would I pay for it? What's my next goal? And me as a mountaineer, I want to take what I learned and push myself and elevate myself to something else. This is, in our world, what we call the holy grail of mountains. It's a mountain in Pakistan called K2. It's only 700 feet lower than Everest, very rarely successfully climbed. It's got storms all the time. It's got steep terrain. It repulses team after team after team. And in 1992, I felt ready to try K2. I'd climbed Kanchenjunga. I'd climbed Everest twice. I thought, I am ready to try this mountain. And I joined forces with a friend of mine from Seattle, Scott Fisher. We didn't have the money to put a team together. We barely had enough money to send ourselves. But we went to Pakistan, and there at base camp, we joined a group of climbers that were kind of loosely connected. And that wasn't something that I was used to. You know, I'd been used to going with a team of people that I knew and that I trusted. And we knew that it was going to be important to unify ourselves, to work together, not individually, but unified to work our way up this monster of a mountain. This is the average angle of terrain on K2, 45 degrees, bottom to top. And knowing that we're going to go up and down this steep terrain day in and day out, carrying loads, whatever, we fix rope to the mountain. We attach it to the rock and the ice. And this allows us a hand line of safety. We have an ascender that slides up and then catches. So that's our hand line going up. And it's also our safety line coming down. This is a typical camp that you see on K2. There's no flat places to camp. So you have to build a platform with rock and snow and gravel and ice. And a lot of times when you go to bed, you stay roped in because you don't want to fall out of bed. And this is this safety line, which we had safeguarded ourselves. I had done my homework about K2. You know, whenever I go to one of these big mountains, I want to become familiar with it. I knew how hard K2 would be. I knew how long it could take. And I'd read about storms destroying camps and avalanches and rescues. And in fact, all of that stuff happened while we were there. We saved 2 or 3 people's lives while we were climbing the mountain. So I was not blindsided by how long it took or how hard it was going to be. I said, that's what this is. That's why we are here. But the majority of people that were there, you know, they started to run out of patience and they started to run out of motivation. And they said, you know what? This is harder than I thought. This is taking longer than I'd planned. And they started to give up and go home. And eventually a few of us, just a handful of us stayed. And Scott and I finally thought we had a window of weather. And for the very first time, this is now almost 3 months into the trip, we established our Camp 4. And what we did to save time was we brought it with us. We set up our little tent, and this is going to be our home or shelter for the night. And the following day, we then hope to climb that final 2,000 feet to the summit, which is by far the steepest section of the entire mountain. This mountain is relentless. And because of that, we had to be relentless as well. So this is the night before our summit day. You know, it's like the night before the Super Bowl or the gold medal race. But, you know, we're not in the Four Seasons Hotel getting a massage with a buffet table, watching ESPN. There's just 2 of us crammed into this tiny little microscopic tent. You know, to save weight, when we make things easier to carry, a really good way to do that is you make them smaller, right? These tents are barely the size of a single bed. They weigh 5 pounds, and 2 guys cram into that tent. And we're thinking tomorrow's our day of days, right? You're excited, you're nervous, you're anxious. What's going to happen? And during the night, yet again, another storm comes in. And by the way, how do you spend time up there? You know, you believe it or not, you have no appetite at these altitudes. Altitude is an extreme appetite suppressant, but you have to stay hydrated. Hydrated is essential to health and safety and strength. And so we spend hours sitting by a little tiny stove, melting snow and ice just to fill our water bottles and just to stay hydrated. And then during the night, another storm came in, and it dumped 3 feet of snow on top of us during the night. We had to get up every hour to shovel the snow off the tent to keep it from collapsing. And this is what we woke up to the next day. It was still storming. It was windy. We had no visibility. What do? Well, we can't go to the summit. The risk is too great. Maybe we should go down. We have to go down. We need to go to safety because we're actually slowly dying up here. At these altitudes, it is known as the death zone because you're not recovering. You're not rebuilding tissue. You're actually slowly withering away. You're not going to die tomorrow, but you can't live up there forever. You're slowly deteriorating. And we thought, man, how long can we sit up here? And I said, you know what? It's mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And we eventually stayed together in that tent for 3 days. Now, this is where you really, really have to like who you're with, right? I mean, to save weight, we only brought one sleeping bag. And what do you do for 3 days? No books, no iPads, no iPhones, no form of entertainment. And I'd been with Scott for 3 months, nothing left to talk about. And you're wondering what's going to happen. If we keep waiting, will we be strong enough to actually go to the summit? And this is where our patience and our persistence paid off. After 3 days of waiting, that window of opportunity came. We left camp at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and this is just at sunrise. We're now about 1,000 feet above camp as the sun is rising, and we're doing the most tricky part of the ascent, this very, very steep traverse at just above 27,000 feet. And several hours later, we were on the summit of K2. This was the hardest test, I think, of my climbing career. I needed patience. I needed persistence. I needed to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Those were all the ingredients to success on that mountain. And it was an amazing experience, but K2 is one of those mountains where you climb it once, you walk away, you don't ever bother going back, right? One and done. So now I'd climbed by accident the 3 highest mountains in the world. And I thought, what next? Because that was all kind of random, random opportunities, random invitations. And I decided then and there, I was going to go climb all 14 of these 8,000 meter peaks. I'd figured I'd done 3, there's only 11 left. And I didn't actually care how long it was going to take. I said, this is my goal. This is my journey. And I called it Endeavor 8,000. Would it take 10 more years? I don't know. Would it take 15 more years? I didn't care. And I think if I didn't give myself a time limit, I would probably accomplish the goal. I knew I had the skill, the motivation, the ability. What I didn't have, though, was the money, right? I'm self-employed now. I'm actually working as a carpenter. And my mom's like, what are you doing? You're a doctor. Here I am working as a carpenter, living in a basement. How do I support multiple years of expeditions? I had to create a startup. I had to find investors to support me. And understanding that, right, investors, when you have a startup, they want something in return. What could I return to the people that were supporting me? So I went to all these outdoor companies who were giving me product. You can get free product all you want. I had a garage full of free stuff. And I convinced them, I said, listen, if you pay me an annual retainer, I will work for your business. I'll help grow your brand. I'll help design. I'll help develop. I'll help prototype. I'll go to sales meetings. You pay me and I will provide you a return on your investment. And once I proved to these companies that I could do that, I created these long-term relationships. And typically money comes from the marketing department. So you end up looking like a race car driver, right? That's how we become professional mountaineers. We don't get paid to climb. We have to earn the money that we use to climb. So with that in mind, I thought the next thing I've got to do is who am I going to do these climbs with? This is 15 more years or so of climbing. What's the team going to be like? And it's pretty hard to keep a big team of people together for that long, right? They're going to come and go and fall by the wayside, and there's going to be conflict. And I thought if I found one person doing the same thing I was doing in the same way with the same level of acceptable risk, that would be the guy that I want to climb with. We could do this as a two-man team. And the number one criteria I thought that I wanted was I have to like that person, right? Because if I don't like you at sea level, I won't like you at 26,000 feet. And second to that, but very close to that, is implicit trust, right? We're roping up in this dangerous arena. We have to trust each other. So I did a lot of what I call mountaineering dating, trying this person, trying that person. And finally, in 1995, I was introduced to and met and climbed with the guy in gray, a climber from Finland named Veikka Gustafsson. We liked each other. He was doing what I was doing. And in fact, in Finland, he was a superstar. Country of 5 million people, he was the first Finn to climb Everest. So he had sponsors. He had the financial support. He even had his own action figure. And the beauty of Veikka was he could pay for his half, I would pay for my half, and off we go to climb these mountains. Very simply, very economically, very efficiently, two of us attacking these giant peaks. And that was a really cool way to go, because we did the work ourselves for ourselves. We didn't have a support team helping to do that. We just said, we're going to roll up our sleeves and everything we earn is self-earned. And I felt really, really good about that. But you have to remember, we are just the two of us in this giant landscape on some of the highest peaks in the world. And I had to remind myself day in, day out, time and time again, that every decision that we make has a consequence, good or bad. Every step that we take toward a summit is one step further from any sort of rescue. There was no rescue squad at base camp. The closest rescue was 1,000 miles away. Helicopters can't fly that high. And so we had to rely on each other to make those safe, conservative decisions. And in spite of that, in my opinion, we were very, very successful. For every 3 expeditions we went on and attempted, 2 out of every 3 was a success. And in my world, that's a really, really good batting average. But I'm probably what I'm more proud of than anything was the fact in my entire 40-plus year career as a climber, I never had an accident. I never needed a rescue. I never lost a teammate. And that is something that I really am proud about, that 100% safety record. Everybody I've gone with, everybody I've come home with, fingers and toes, everything. And that safety is what I was looking for. Otherwise, I didn't feel it was going to be worth it. But, we had lumps and bumps along the way. We had what I call non-successes. This is a mountain in Pakistan called Broad Peak, one of the 8,000-meter peaks. Veikka and I spent 2 months on this mountain. And on our way to the summit, we were forced to stop 100 feet from the top. 100 feet from the top. Because of dangerous avalanche conditions, we had to stop and we had to turn around and we had to go down. I'm pretty far into my career now. And you can imagine what I call the external pressures are starting to build. I have my own pressure of success that I'm pushing towards. I'm close to finishing these 14 peaks. Do I still want to turn around and walk away? Let alone the sponsors that are supporting me. They want success. I've got the media following me at that point. They are hoping for success. And I've seen that a lot in my career and my peer group where those external pressures start to change how you do what you do. You start to break your rules. And in my world, in your world as well, there's constant risk, right? And if you live in a world of risk, you might become a little bit comfortable with that risk because it's ever present. And based on that, you also might become complacent, right? It's that one day you've been doing things the right way year after year, day after day, that one day you decide, you know what, nothing's ever happened. I'm going to step over the edge just to accomplish this goal, just to get home earlier, just to save a little money. And I saw that as well in my peer group. Those external pressures pushed people to do things they normally wouldn't have. And a lot of those guys never come home. They step over the edge and there's no way to come back. For me, it was like, you know what? I'm doing this for me. I don't care what other people think, good or bad. It has to be for you. And the rules and the foundation that you learned at the beginning have to be the same at the end. And for me, again, it was all about being patient. If it doesn't happen today, I pull back, I retreat, and I go back and try again. And in fact, Vic and I, we went back the following year and we climbed that last 100 feet to the summit. So it eventually happens. So I kept going, kept climbing these mountains year after year, amazing journeys, really a lot of fun, a lot of hard work with my buddy Veka. And then 17 years into this journey, I had accomplished 13 of the 14. I had one mountain left on the list, Annapurna. Remember, this is that mountain I read about as a kid. And people kind of thought, oh, you left it at the end just for the cool story. But in fact, I had already tried Annapurna twice. This mountain scared me like no other mountain. It's got objective dangers off the charts, avalanches that shower down all of its faces unpredictably. You could be the smartest, fastest, best trained climber in the world. You cannot outrun one of these avalanches. The risk is great. And Annapurna is known as the most dangerous. Only 180 people had climbed it. 60 had died. That's a 1 out of 3. And I understood that and I realized that and I started to think about that based on my level of personal acceptable risk. I said, not worth it. Do I go back? Don't want to. Because I thought if I died on Annapurna, that would not look at on my resume, right? And I thought long and hard and fast about that. Like, no, I shouldn't go back. It's not worth it. Obviously, I went back, and I made the decision thinking about it, saying, rather than being at home deciding it's not going to work out, what if I go again, go to the bottom of it, and perhaps in some miraculous way the conditions will be better. I won't know that unless I'm actually there to see it and to let the mountain tell me face to face. And so that's the decision that my buddy Vake and I made. We promised each other we're going to go all the way to base camp, and there and then we'll make our final decision. If conditions were bad, we'd come home knowing we made the right decision. But we wanted to be there in case conditions might be good. And at that point, I didn't make those decisions lightly either. I was married at the point with my wife, Paula, for 10 years. And we had 3 kids at home too. So I had a lot of responsibility to think about. But believe it or not, my wife allowed me to do what I did. She never once said no. She trusted me. She believed in me. I mean, she knew there was that 1 in a million risk. She understood that. But she knew how I trained and how I thought and how I planned and how I prepared. And when you leave and go to work, when you walk out the door, you've got that support person behind you, right? They elevate you. They lighten your load. They become part of your team. And I thank my wife for letting me do what I did. So this is now the spring of 2005. My 18th year doing this. We get to the bottom of Annapurna. We sit there, we watch, we listen, and it was phenomenal. The mountain was colder. It was glued together. There was no avalanche activity to speak of. And we happened to be at the right place at the right time. And we took advantage of that. It was not an easy climb. This was not like a rollover and come climb to the top. It made me work. And we worked together. And we'd been together for 10 years. And you know, when you have that perfect partner, there's hours that go by with nonverbal communication. You're thinking in the same way. You're helping each other. And you just keep going and going. And eventually together in May of that year, we were on the summit of Annapurna together. And to me, this was literally a dream come true. You know, this thing I'd been visualizing, dreaming about, thinking I might never get there. 18 years later, I'm actually there. It was unbelievable. And you think, why do you do that? what's in it for you? You know, because there's no gold medal up there. There's no trophy. ESPN isn't up there to interview you. You're just looking at your buddy, smiling, going, wow, that was a hell of a lot of fun. And to me, I felt proud about what I did and how I did it, and that I accomplished something that I set out to do. You know, I tend to be pretty persistent and pretty stubborn. And that was a great moment. And then looking at on Annapurna, you know, why was it at the end? And in fact, it had to be, because I needed 30 years of experience to take that test. You know, 5 years earlier, I might have made mistakes I didn't know I was making. So it came at the right time in my career. And I think you guys are going to have something equivalent, this thing where you're like, I'm ready for this today. Bring it, right? And that's what Annapurna was for me. And obviously, poetically, this book that put me on this path, that started me climbing, and that ended my journey on Annapurna. So in closing now, I want to leave you with this the last sentence of this book, which to me, this book changed my life. And it was written by the leader of the climb, Maurice Herzog, one of the two people, the guy pictured here on the summit. And the last sentence of this book, which I think is very poetic, he said, "There are other Annapurnas in the lives of men." And I think that's an amazing metaphor for life and a journey and goals and aspirations. You know, the horizon of your career is not flat. It's bumpy. There's mountain after mountain. You're going to keep climbing and keep climbing. And typically, hopefully, those mountains are going to get bigger, because you're going to take what you learned on a particular event and you're going to do something bigger and something harder and more challenging. And you set yourself up for success, right? By the planning and the preparation to be able to take that on. And that makes life interesting, where you keep pushing and trying to be better. I feel like I'm an apprentice climber. I'm always learning something new. I don't want to feel like I've got it all figured out, right? That's not a good thing to do. And obviously it's that unity, that partnership, that collaboration that helps all of you work better and safer. And that's what I found in my career as well. That partnership was integral. Those are key ingredients for me, and I think for you. When you're doing something hard, when you're doing something which a lot of people don't want to do, when you're doing something that isn't really fun, you have to be passionate. And that's why you're all here. I'm certain that you're all passionate about what you do. And that's, to me, the ultimate ingredient to success, is that passion. Thank you very much.